So, time for our second session then, a standalone session focusing on the different approaches taken by national and international governing bodies to the participation of trans athletes, and the presentation will consider the factors that should be considered when regulating trans athlete eligibility. So, would you please give a very warm welcome to Chris Lavey.
Hello everybody. Very nice to be here. Some of you may know that I started my legal career as a case officer at Sport Resolutions, and at that time this conference was really just a twinkle in Richard Harry's eye. But since then it's gone from strength to strength, and as an organisation it's very nice to be invited back. So, trans eligibility in sports, this is a complex, sometimes polarising issue. This is, from my perspective, that I'm going to give you is a legal one. It's a complementary lens through which to view the issue. There are others. I'll try my best. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the science. Generally, I'll try and do this in 4 parts, though, looking at some of the background facts, the dilemma for sports governing bodies, and then the approaches taken by different sports, and also the legal test. So the first thing to be aware of is that this is really an eligibility issue. It's an integrity issue, but it's an eligibility issue. So eligibility categories in sport are there to ensure safe competition, ensure fair competition, and they're not about misconduct or wrongdoing in any way. And there's examples there on the slide. Parasport categories, we want the result to be determined by skill determination, not by the degree of someone's disability. Age categories, we don't think it's fair for a child to compete against an adult, or even for a master's athlete to compete against an adult. Weight categories, we don't think it's fair for example, a flyweight boxer to compete against a heavyweight boxer. But the most common category in sport is the male and female divide. So why do we have that? Well, to answer that question, we need to talk about sex and we need to talk about gender. It's important in this area to be respectful and to be precise. It's obviously a contested area. It's not well understood in some sectors. Sexual orientation, gender expression, these things are not relevant. What we are concerned with is gender identity, so that's internal, that's a person's sense of their own self. It might be male, it might be female, it could be non-binary. And we're also concerned with sex, which is about biological attributes. That is, most living things are divided this way because it relates back to reproduction, but it's overwhelmingly binary, it's male or it's female. And so for most people, sex and gender are concordant, they match up. For a transgender person, sex and gender don't match up, they're different. So going back to the question, why do we have these separate male and female categories? Well, the reason is the male performance advantage. And can we quantify what that is? Well, people have done the research and they look at world records in various different sports to understand what the difference is. 10%, 20%, 30% in some sports, even higher when it comes down to particular individual skills. Obviously there is a very significant overlap between populations of men and women, but at the very elite level, at the individual level, this enormous performance gap really does matter. And if you put it in real terms, we live in a world of marginal gains where very small differences make a big impact. A 10 to 20% advantage is going to determine competition. And what it also means is that even sub-elite males, so males that are have less than a 10% advantage, would also be the very best female athletes. So what we can tell from that is that if the male and female categories were combined, that we wouldn't get female athletes on the podium, we wouldn't get female athletes even at the start, and we lose out on all the great things that female sport has to offer, not just for sport and our enjoyment, but the wider benefits for society. So that is why the female category is separate, it's protected from this male performance advantage. What causes that male performance advantage? Well, there's no serious debate about this. Sports scientists all agree that men have got bigger muscles, they've got larger hearts, more hemoglobin, and larger VO2 max, and as a result of that, they have more power, more strength, more speed, better fuel utilisation. Those are all the main physical attributes of sport performance. And the reason for those sex differences in physical performance is exposure from puberty onwards to high levels of testosterone. And there's a large amount of scientific evidence that demonstrates that and backs it up. I'm not going to go through that in detail, frankly, because I'm not a scientist. This graph is just one small example of that. So testosterone in prepubescent children, both boys and girls, is present, but it's very low levels. And then at puberty, the testes in males produce testosterone levels that are 15 times higher than that. And it's that testosterone that then drives those physiological changes and leads to the development of secondary sex characteristics. So we know therefore that the male performance advantage emerges at puberty and it's caused by testosterone. So just to recap, we've got a protected female category. It's protected from this male performance advantage, and if we have a protected category, then we need to define eligibility criteria for it. We need to be able to say who's in and who's out. And that's just exactly the same way that we do for parasport categories. And we have the classification system, age categories where we have age groups and dates of birth and that kind of thing, and weight categories where we have weigh-ins and weight categories. So what is the eligibility criteria for the female category? Well, it's changing over time. Historically, sex and gender was always thought to be concordant, and it matched up, and it was binary, so it was no issue. Everyone was assumed to be either male or female, and it was straightforward. But of course, as society moves forward, as science is better understood, there are two types of individual, two types of person who challenge this binary divide. The first is trans women. The second is people with a 46XY difference of sex development who identify as female. So there's also trans men. They would maybe also want to compete in sport, but that is less of an issue because typically if they want to compete in the sport in which they identify, that would be the male category, so we're not concerned about a male performance advantage, it's the other direction. So I'm just going to park trans men and DSD athletes and really concentrate on trans women. The sports have to address this issue in some way. The female category is protected, so they've got to decide where to draw this line. As Lord Kerr has said, as a federation president, I don't have the luxury to do nothing. Self-identification might be an option, but that would defeat the purpose of the female category, because if anyone can identify into a protected category, it's not very well protected. Legal sex could be another option, but that doesn't always match up with biological sex, and increasingly in a number of countries, people are able to change their legal sex. I think it's fair to say that in general, sports want to include trans athletes if possible, but they're not willing to do that at the expense of fair competition or of safety. And so the question becomes whether there are conditions that can then protect fair competition and protect safety in the female category. How does the sport go about considering those kind of issues? There is some guidance available. So November 2021, the IOC issued its framework. here was to offer international federations a principled approach to developing eligibility criteria. It contains 10 principles, and it really reflects the fact that eligibility criteria will be sport-specific, and that there's no one solution for the IOC to impose top-down. This framework has been criticised by the International Federation of Sports Medicine, who said that it focuses on the human rights perspective at the expense of science and biology. There are other pieces of guidance available. Around the same time, the UK Sports Council's issued its own guidance, and that does acknowledge the biology. It does acknowledge the fact that this is an issue of conflicting rights that need to be resolved. It contains 10 principles as well, slightly different to the IOC, but nonetheless 10 principles. A lot more focused on practical guidance to really help sports consider this issue and to decide how they are going to address it in their own context. Both those documents are freely available online and well worth reading. So for trans women, what eligibility conditions are there that can ensure that this male performance advantage is removed? Well, like I said, we know the reason for this sex performance difference is testosterone. And this graph here illustrates this big difference between male and female testosterone levels. It's a logarithmic scale, so don't be confused by that. The female range is between 0.06 and 1.68, going up to 2 in some studies. And then the male range is much, much higher, over 7 up to around 30. And so what scientists are thinking is, what is it that happens if you reduce testosterone levels? Remember, testosterone is just a proxy here in the same way that we use kilograms for weight. So what happens if we reduce these testosterone levels from the high male range down into the low female range? Well, trans women already do that as part of gender-affirming hormone treatment. That is the treatment for someone in a male body who has a female gender identity. It's the recognised standard of care. So it's been done a lot, and we know what the effect is. We know that it reduces muscle mass and it reduces haemoglobin levels. It changes the body. But that doesn't tell us everything we need to know. We know the direction of travel, but we don't know, well, it's still slightly uncertain as to what degree this testosterone suppression reduces muscle mass and haemoglobin and so on. Do those reductions remove this male performance advantage, or do they just reduce it partially? And obviously that's highly relevant to whether it's fair or safe to include trans women in sport. And the answer, unfortunately, like every good question at law school, is it depends on the sport. And each sport really has to make its own assessment based primarily on the nature of the sport itself. So what the physiological demands of the sport are, and many of you working in sport will be able to will know that, and it will factor into many other decisions. That's the first thing, the nature of the sport, but also the scientific evidence. So how testosterone suppression affects those specific physical attributes that are relevant to the particular sport. A few contrasting approaches. Look at where different sports have ended up. World Rugby said that even after testosterone suppression, there's a performance advantage that is retained by trans women, and of course there's a safety risk as well. Rugby's a collision sport. The International Federation for Mixed Martial Arts, it's a combat sport, and they've come out with the same outcome, and that is even where participants are already further categorised into weight categories, so matched by weight. Swimming, there was a concern in aquatics that the bigger frames, hearts, muscles, lung capacity that are all built during male puberty, that those aren't sufficiently impacted by testosterone suppression, and so this male performance advantage is retained. So World Aquatics' new rule of last year was to say that a trans woman can only compete in the female category if they didn't experience that male puberty, which in effect means if they suppress their testosterone and block puberty around from the age of 12. And World Athletics recently adopted that same approach. In contrast, a number of IFs have also assessed the evidence in the context of their sports and determined that testosterone suppression does adequately reduce the male performance advantage, and that's consistent with the FIN's 2021 consensus statement that said, or at least proposed testosterone suppression to below 5 nanomoles, so still way above the female range, for at least 12 months. Recently, the UCI and World Rowing have revised their rules based on new research that's emerged in the last few years, and the rationale there is that muscle strength and power is important in both cycling and rowing, and that recent studies have suggested that testosterone suppression takes longer than 12 months to adequately reduce muscle mass, strength and power. So they have selected a duration of 24 months and reduced the testosterone limit to 2.5 nanomoles, again, just above the female range. So this is all a bit confusing, it's all a bit tricky. Why do we have all these different divergent approaches? There's a number of different reasons, some or all of them might apply in different cases. Obviously, the demands of each sport are different. So some are endurance-based, some are strength, some are power-based, some skill-based, and some contain various different combinations of all of those attributes. And all of those attributes are differently affected by testosterone suppression. So the impact is not always the same. There's also the issue of timing. So most regulations tend to say that they are a living document, that this will change over time. And the regulations tend to be based on the most up-to-date scientific evidence. But of course, it takes time for sports to revise their rules and work through those processes again. So it's a research topic of recent interest. There's lots of new studies published regularly, and that's why IFs keep their rules under review. There's also different priorities. Some sports, safety is a much bigger issue. Contact, combat, collision sports, it's clear that it might not be an issue in all sports. And then finally, there can be different approaches taken at international level as to national governing body level. Domestic law is obviously relevant to the national governing bodies, not to the international ones. And arguably there are higher demands of inclusion at the grassroots level, which an international federation doesn't need to be concerned about. So I'm sure that the lawyers in the room will no doubt be keen for me to start discussing legislation and case law and regulations. I don't want to disappoint them. I'll talk a little about the test under international human rights and discrimination law, and then a little bit about domestic equality legislation. So human rights, these are basic rights and freedoms that are inherent to all human beings. Most human rights are not absolute, they can be qualified. And discrimination per se is not unlawful. In fact, we do it all the time in sport. We discriminate against athletes based on age, based on weight, based on disability, based on sex, gender reassignment. There is a legal test in international human rights law that takes into account all of the circumstances and other interests that are being protected by the federations in order to decide then whether it's lawful or unlawful to treat people differently. And this issue really involves weighing up conflicting legal rights, and that was recognised in the Castor Semenya case. These are quotes from the decision. on the one hand, you have the right of DSD, or in this case transgender athletes, to compete in the competition category that's consistent with their gender identity and their legal sex. And then on the other hand, you have the rights of cis female athletes who are already disadvantaged as compared to male athletes, and also compared to the biology of DSD and transgender athletes. And it's not possible, as the conclusion, it's not possible to give effect to one set of rights without taking from the other. So in effect, you have to decide. You have to go one way or the other. So what is this legal test? Well, if you have a discriminatory rule, then it will be lawful if the regulator can prove that it serves a legitimate objective and that it's necessary to achieve that objective, and it's also proportionate to achieve that objective. So you can see legally it's presumed that everyone should be included, and if the rules are challenged, then the regulator will need to justify them with reference to this legal test. That is exactly what happened in the Semenya case. So a CAS panel there looked at the three-stage test and said there is a legitimate aim. Ensuring fair competition in female athletics is a very legitimate objective. Obviously safety wasn't an issue in that case. The panel also found that the DSD regulations were necessary, and they weighed the interests against each other. They did that balancing out, and they said the DSD regulations were proportional. So if that same test is then applied to another international federation's transgender rules, the same test would apply. Semenya isn't transgender, of course, but the situation is comparable. The reasoning is relevant. The legal test is the same. So, legitimate aim, it would be the same depending on the sport. It would be safety or fairness in the category. Might even be both. Necessity, I think it's probably going to be met. It might be different if it's, let's say, equestrian sport or chess, for example. Really, that depends on the magnitude of the performance difference between males and females. And then proportionality, that's the thornier one, and it's, again, like what I'm saying earlier, it will depend very much on the nature of the sport and also on the nature of the restrictions, and the panel will have to weigh all that up with the alleged harm that the rules might cause. So CAS awards are appealable to the Swiss Supreme Court. That's what happened in Semenya, and the Swiss Supreme Court dismissed Semenya's appeal, and they recognised that even unchangeable, inherent biological characteristics can still distort competition. And what it did is effectively recognise and emphasise that it's the primary role of the governing body to determine what eligibility criteria are necessary to protect this protected female category. So the domestic law, the lawful discrimination test is broadly consistent across most domestic legal systems. Some countries have specific carve-outs for sport from national anti-discrimination law. The UK is one of those. So section 1 here effectively permits discrimination on the basis of sex in the context of sport. So it enables sports to set up female-only competitions, for example. Subsection 2 deals with trans athletes and permits different regulation of, different treatment of trans athletes. Sports will need to consider whether their sport is gender affected. So like I said, if you are chess, the position might be different, for example. But also the sport will need to consider whether the regulations are necessary to achieve safety or fair competition. And that is, well, it's never been tested as far as I know, this provision. Sports are maybe likely to have a margin of discretion in assessing that. But also this necessity test may also involve an element of proportionality. In any event, a sport is going to have to justify its rules with reference to the evidence, with reference to the science. And so again, it's going to be looking at the nature of the sport and the science on the effects and limits of transition. So what's next? More scientific research, ideally. There is some, it's a growing body. Ideally, we're looking at the effect of male to female transition on physical performance. It's not easy, you can see why this is a tricky study to do. Ideally, we're looking for a cohort of elite transgender athletes, but who have not started transition yet. So you're able to then follow them through that period of transition. That could take, well, you're interested in finding out, the effects over 2, 3, 5 years. So you can see why this is going to take some time. Also query whether some of the issues that Baz and Emma have already talked about this morning, different angles of hips, menstruation, other issues that are specific to women's sport will also be relevant factors. We're very much focusing on testosterone as a proxy because that's the best thing we've got, but there might be other factors that are relevant. So that is really a snapshot in time of the issue. There's no easy answers, there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Since the female category is protected, it's important that sports really engage and define the eligibility criteria for it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
It was such a thorough presentation. He's answered every question I had. So, to you. So, if you've got any questions, then please feel free to ask them. If we can get the microphone, our audio team speeding down to the centre of the reservation. Thank you very much indeed. There is one question I want to ask you, Chris, and that is, I didn't go to law school. I did politics and journalism and Welsh. I'm not going to ask you the question in Welsh. But do you think that ultimately we will see more cases in the courts, or are you going to say it depends?
Will we see more cases in the courts? I suspect we will. I don't know how many there will be. We need to ask an athlete's lawyer. We are acting for the federations. If there are cases, we'll be ready for it. But obviously the legal test is an important part of the analysis when sports are considering how they're going to regulate. So when sport is in that position, it's important to do consultation, so to speak to affected athletes, also to speak to cis female athletes, get their views, to look at the legal position, to look at the ethics, to look at the science, and the science is really the most important.
Thank you very much indeed. It was a terrific presentation. Right, I think our question is at the front. We have a microphone. Hello, how are you?
Very good, thank you, Jason. Chris, thank you for that fantastic presentation. I was taking lots of photographs. John Merzat, KC at Livingston. I'm really interested in this idea. The cases that you cited were courts of arbitration for sport and then on appeal to the SFT. That is a sport-specific form that recognises, in effect, that sports are hugely autonomous and self-regulate. And that Semenya decision was a slight fudge because it upheld, World Athletics rules, but said subject to review, which is essentially the point you made in terms of science. And Semenya didn't go all the way on the merits to the European Court of Human Rights. And I'm interested, you've seen a pushback over the last year or so, certainly at European level, to say sport is not an exception to the general provisions of human rights, competition and the rest. Do you think, slightly cruel question, but if this was challenged within domestic courts or tribunals that maybe are not so familiar and deferential to sports, that the outcome might be different in terms of discrimination findings or the rest? It's quite a difficult question, but you can see where I'm coming from, I hope.
Yeah, absolutely, and it might very well be different, but like all litigation, it will depend on the evidence that's put forward, it will depend on the arguments, it depends on the jurisdiction as well, because if the case is brought in England or Australia, where they do have specific carve-outs for discrimination within sport, then that could be very, that could really change the analysis. as for the European Court of Human Rights, Semenya has issued an application at the European Court. That is pending at the moment, so we'll wait and see. The respondent in that case, the way it operates is that the respondent is not World Athletics, it's the state of Switzerland who have failed in her eyes to uphold her convention rights. But World Athletics has been granted rights to respond, to intervene in that case, and it's done that. But we are still waiting for a decision. So we may well have a bit more guidance on that kind of thing at a higher, more general level soon.
Thank you for your question. Any further questions before we break? Yes. Hello. The microphone is on its way. I think it's on the third row there. Thank you very much. One more question and then we'll take a short break. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark Scott from British Fire Fund. Just wanted to ask, do you have any advice to governing bodies who have set policy around this topic to help regulate their eligibility? So we've come out with our policy last year, and we're in the process of putting in place a process to deal with where concerns around eligibility are raised. And I just want to know if you've got any thoughts or advice that can help us around that process in terms of regulating that eligibility.
So what I take from what you're saying is how to deal with the process of managing athletes and athletes who might come to you, or issues that might arise if another athlete, a cis female for example, questions the identity of a certain athlete. These are all really, really sensitive issues and questions, and I think we're right to be thinking about them. There should be, I think, mechanisms by which sports are able to assess these applications, and they should be as confidential as possible. But of course, to enable people to compete in a separate gender category that's then discussed publicly, that might not always be possible. But apart from that, it's hard to assess without the specifics.
Thank you so much for your questions. Oh, we've got time for one more? Yes, we have. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Keeper from the University of Gloucestershire. Obviously, there's several sports governing bodies who have used medication to suppress testosterone levels. I'm just wondering whether there's room within that necessary proportionality test for sports bodies to think about other ways, such as where it's possible, handicapping, things like that. I think that might be something that should be looked at.
It's one possibility. I think if you, it's a matter for sport really, but I can imagine a lot of sports would be quite sensitive and not particularly keen on the idea of changing the very nature of their sport to accommodate certain athletes. You don't want to make a 100-metre race 105 metres for trans women, for example. This was considered, we had another case for World Athletics involving a blade runner, so Lycos to Pistorius, but recently just before the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, where he had biological legs to his knee, but then blades after that. He wanted to compete in the able-bodied 400 metres. World Athletics said no, and they were able to hold that decision, showing he had no fair advantage. But one of the questions there was, could an option be that he, there be some other facilitation made for him? But the CASPAR didn't think that was appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, we are going to take a very short break. We'll be back at 11:45. And can I urge you all, I know not all of you are on social media, but we want to make a bit of noise this year at the conference, so please use that hashtag, let us know what you think of the conference and any